Hey everyone, and welcome back to our AP World History Review series. Today, we're diving deep into a super important topic from Unit 6, Indigenous Responses to State Expansion. It's easy to think of imperialism as a one-way street, where powerful states just rolled over everyone else, but that's not the full story. The people on the receiving end of imperialism didn't just sit back and accept it. They resisted, they rebelled, and they adapted in some truly remarkable ways. Understanding this resistance is key to acing your exam, because it shows you can see the complexity and nuance of history. We can break it down into a few major categories. First, you have direct resistance, which means armed conflict and rebellion. Then there's resistance through creating new states on the peripheries of empires. And finally, there's resistance through culture and belief systems, which is often called anti-colonial nationalism. Let's start with direct resistance, because it's what most people think of first. In the Americas, indigenous peoples had been resisting European encroachment for centuries. A powerful example is the ghost dance movement in the United States during the late 19th century. This was a spiritual and political movement among various Native American groups. The prophet Vovaka taught that if they performed the ghost dance, the buffalo would return and the white settlers would disappear. It was a vision of restoring a world lost to colonization. This spiritual revival was seen as a direct threat by the U.S. government, which tragically led to the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. Effectively ending the movement but leaving a lasting legacy of resistance. Let's travel across the Pacific to Australia and New Zealand. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia engaged in decades of resistance against British settlement from the late 1700s onwards. This wasn't one single war, but a series of scattered local conflicts often called the Australian Frontier Wars. They used their deep knowledge of the land to conduct guerrilla-style warfare against the frustrated British colonists, while the British ultimately prevailed due to superior weaponry and devastating diseases. This resistance is a crucial part of Australian history that challenges the myth of a peaceful settlement. Now, let's look at the Ambori in New Zealand. Their story is a bit different because of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. The Ambori thought they were agreeing to a partnership with the British, but the English version of the treaty implied a complete surrender of sovereignty. When they realized the British were taking their land and ignoring their rights, they fought back in a series of conflicts known as the New Zealand Wars, which lasted for several decades in the mid-19th century. The Maori were skilled fighters and strategists, building fortified villages called PI that were incredibly difficult to attack. Although they ultimately lost much of their land, their resistance established a strong foundation for the modern Ambori rights movement. Moving over to Africa, the resistance was fierce and widespread. One of the most famous examples is the Xhosa cattle-killing movement in South Africa from 1856 to 1857. This is a complex and tragic story. A young prophetess named Nonkawuz had a vision that if the Xhosa people killed all their cattle and destroyed their crops, their ancestors would rise from the dead and drive the British colonists into the sea. The prophecy didn't come true. Instead, it led to a massive famine that devastated the Xhosa people, killing tens of thousands. This made it easier for the British to seize their land. While it ended in disaster, historians see it as a desperate act of resistance born from the immense pressure of colonial expansion and disease. It was an attempt to use spiritual means to reclaim their world, when military options seemed impossible. Another powerful example from Africa is Samori Toure's resistance in West Africa. He was a brilliant military leader and state builder. From the 1860s until the 1890s, he created the Wassoulou Empire, a powerful Islamic state in what is now Guinea. He built a modern professional army and even had workshops to manufacture and repair rifles. For years, he successfully fought off French colonial forces using guerrilla tactics and a scorched earth policy. He moved his entire empire eastward to escape the French advance. Eventually, he was captured in 1898, but his long and sophisticated resistance made him a legend and a symbol of anti-colonial struggle in Africa. Let's not forget the modest war in Sudan. In the 1880s, a religious leader named Muhammad Omad declared himself the Mahdi, the guided one who was prophesied to appear at the end of times to restore true Islam. He led a successful rebellion against the Egyptian Ottoman and later British rule in Sudan. His forces, known as the Ansar, were incredibly motivated by their faith. In 1885, they famously captured the city of Khartoum and defeated the British general Charles Gordon. They established an independent, modest state that lasted for about 15 years, until it was finally crushed by a technologically superior Anglo-Egyptian force in 1898. The modest war is a prime example of how religious fervor could unite people and fuel a powerful anti-imperialist state. Now, let's look at the second major category of response: creating new states on the edges of empires. Sometimes, indigenous groups weren't directly fighting a European power, but were reacting to the massive changes and instability that imperialism brought to their region. They saw a power vacuum and seized the opportunity to build their own states. A fantastic example is the rise of the Zulu kingdom in southern Africa in the early 19th century. Under the leadership of the legendary military genius Shaka Zulu, various Nguni-speaking groups were unified into a formidable, highly centralized state. Shaka revolutionized warfare with new tactics and weapons, like the short-stabbing spear, the ikwa, and the bullhorn formation. While the Zulu kingdom was initially formed in response to local pressures, its existence directly challenged the British and Boer settlers who were expanding into the region. This led to the Anglo-Zulu War in 1879, where the Zulu famously defeated a British force at the Battle of Isandlwana before ultimately being conquered. The Zulu kingdom's formation shows how imperial pressures could indirectly lead to the creation of powerful new indigenous states. Similarly, in Southeast Asia, the expanding influence of the British and French created new political dynamics in what is now Thailand, the Kingdom of Siam. Under rulers like King Mongkut and King Chulalongkorn, cleverly played the British and French against each other. They modernized their government, military, and infrastructure, adopting just enough European-style reforms to be seen as a civilized nation that could manage its own affairs. By acting as a buffer state between British Burma and French Indochina, Siam was the only country in the region to maintain its independence throughout the colonial period. This wasn't armed resistance, but a savvy political and diplomatic strategy for survival. Finally, let's talk about the third form of response: cultural and religious resistance, which often evolves into nationalism. This is about preserving identity in the face of colonial attempts to erase it. It's about saying, our culture, our beliefs, and our way of life are valuable and worth fighting for. This often started with religious ideas. We've already seen this with the Ghost Dance and the Modest War. These movements used spiritual beliefs to unite people against a common enemy. The idea was that their faith gave them a strength that colonial guns couldn't defeat. This religious resistance often laid the groundwork for modern nationalism. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, a new generation of leaders emerged. Many of them were educated in Western-style schools, where they learned about ideas like democracy, liberty, and self-determination. They turned these very ideas against their colonial rulers, arguing that the principles of freedom and justice should apply to everyone, not just Europeans. This was the birth of anti-colonial nationalism. They began to imagine their communities not just as tribes or religious groups, but as nations deserving of their own independent states. This intellectual and cultural resistance would blossom into the major independence movements of the 20th century. So, to wrap it all up for your AP exam, when you think about topic 6.3, remember that indigenous responses to imperialism were diverse and complex. Don't just think of military defeats. Think about direct resistance. Like the New Zealand Wars and Samori Tours fight, think about the creation of new states like the Zulu Kingdom, and think about the powerful forces of spiritual and cultural resistance, like the Ghost Dance and the rise of nationalism. These responses show agency, creativity, and a powerful refusal to be erased from history. They demonstrate that the colonized were not passive victims, but active participants who shaped their own destinies in the face of overwhelming odds. Make sure you understand these examples because they're perfect for your essays and DBQs. Hit that like button and subscribe for more AP World Review. See you in the next video.